Um, Thank you everyone for coming and for your time. It's a really important moment where we all gather in order to stop a potentially catastrophic law. Just for the context of background, the death penalty law against Palestinians in held for crimes has passed the first reading in the Israeli Knesset by 39 votes to 16. So a big majority of the Knesset members representing the Israeli parliament have approved and passed this law. For Human Rights Watch, the situation inside the Israeli prisons and detention facilities has extremely deteriorated since October 2023. But of course, we understand that Israel's extrajudicial killings of Palestinians has been ongoing for decades. And this form of applying a law that, imposes on courts to authorize the application of the death penalty with regards to crimes that the law identifies or describes as, when it includes killings of Israelis either intentionally or recklessly, and if that act is motivated by racism or hostilities towards the public, and committed with the objective to harm the state of Israel, and in general the Jewish people. So while the law does not explicitly note that it should be applied on Palestinians, the way it is written and the specific conditions that are and the elements that are proposed in this law make it very much understandable that the only ones who will be held under this death penalty are Palestinians. And to better understand the situation or the alarming situation that brings this law into life, although it only passed the first reading and will be sent to a committee before being proposed for a second and third reading, we need to act together in order to immediately abolish and withdraw such a law from coming to life. As I mentioned, with the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, whether in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, or Gaza, we are seeing Palestinian lives being taken for granted and never having the attention on it. It's really mind-blowing that Israeli authorities would even go a step further into codifying a death penalty when for over a decade there has been increasing reports of extrajudicial killings across the West Bank. Just in 2022, Human Rights Watch published a report on these extrajudicial killings that also include children and individuals who the immediate policy of Israeli authorities is shoot to kill. There's no understanding of the application of international human rights law, where the use of force should only be used in certain circumstances when there's imminent threat to life of an individual. But in many cases, what we see is that the policy is just shoot to kill without any imminent. But what I also want to really clarify that the conditions inside detention have already escalated to the worst, where we are seeing increased number of Palestinian deaths inside custody. At least 77 Palestinians in the past 2 years have died inside Israeli custody. And according to autopsies, these individuals were either clearly, had imposed upon them medical neglect, where if they had diabetes or chronic illnesses or injuries that they acquired during abusive detention conditions, or during their arrest, or even prior to their detention, were almost always met with neglect or intentional not providing with the proper medical treatment inside detention. So we're talking about 77 Palestinians inside detention who who died inside Israeli detention, either from clear medical neglect or health violence to their health, but as well as from the abuses they've been subjected to, whether it was Physicians for Human Rights Israel or other Palestinian organizations who were part of the autopsies, reveal really the conditions inside detentions are leading to deaths that shouldn't happen. So in many times what we see is that there's complete lack of impunity, and this law being passed in the parliament and in the first reading with a huge majority only shows the culture of impunity that is given to the reckless killings of Palestinians. With the language of the law used, it in a way is part and parcel of Israel's apartheid, crimes against humanity of apartheid that it imposes on Palestinians in the occupied territory. When the law is visibly characterized in order to only hold Palestinians under this death penalty, it feeds into and plays an integral part into Israel's sustaining of oppression and domination of Palestinians inside the occupied territory. We oppose the death penalty in all contexts, and it is a form of torture and ill treatment and cruel and degrading treatment. But when Human Rights Watch itself, along with consistent reports by Israeli organizations, Palestinian organizations, even the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, have repeatedly reported on abuse inside detention, including torture, sexual violence, as we just heard, rape, deprivation of food and water, brutal prison raids inside detention that already form a culture of impunity that is allowed in many cases by Israel's national minister, Ben Gvir. What the point I want to emphasize is, for years and years, we've known about the brutal detention conditions Palestinians have been subjected to, and the silence of the international community not pushing Israeli authorities and holding them accountable to what happens inside Israeli detention only emboldens Israeli officials to take it a step further, understanding that this impunity gives them a green light to commit or to institutionalize and use laws in order to commit more atrocities and violations against Palestinians. The law basically authorizes Israeli military courts to impose a death penalty on civilians. And this cannot be, not read within the understanding that these Israeli military courts are also part of the apartheid system that Israel imposes. The conviction rate in these military courts for Palestinians is above 99% according to Israeli human rights organizations. So there's no due process guarantees. Most Palestinians are presented before this court without the main principle of fair trial guarantees or the main principle of innocent until proven guilty. When we have 99.7% of Palestinians convicted in these military courts, we can definitely understand how this law would be weaponized against the right to life to Palestinians. And when we talk about the death penalty, there's no going back to it. There's no retroactively, providing a way to really deal with this, because a life will be taken immediately. So the concern here is honestly the lack of attention on the harms and not only harms but the brutality that such a law provides. But we also recognize that this law is being pushed by Israeli officials, by the Minister of National Security Ben Gvir, in a context where the Israeli society is going into elections next year, and we cannot look into this law without the politicization that it is being used and weaponized under. maybe I'll just briefly sum it up to say when we see the death numbers of Palestinians inside Israeli detention rising, and when we see reports of extrajudicial killings rising, all in the same context and time frame where Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip have been subjected to extermination and acts of genocide, we do need to hold ourselves accountable to how much are we pushing states to really respect the law, or really understand what the role is in order to stop or uproot immediately such weaponization of the law, in order to really enforce more domination and more oppression over the Palestinians. I just would like to remind us all that when there were reports of a Palestinian detainee in Sdei Timan being gang raped by 9 Israeli soldiers, there was a whole issue in the Israeli parliament whether these soldiers should be protected or whether they should be held accountable or responsible. The Israeli parliament was discussing and saying that these soldiers are our heroes. We should not be prosecuting them. So when we look at the atmosphere and culture of impunity and support that is given by the whole, Israeli authorities, but also those who should be investigating these crimes, it's a really shattering moment where we need to unify together in order to push as much as possible for this law not to even reach the second or third reading. We should not, again, dehumanize the Palestinians and allow any even talk of such a draft law to happen. So again, just to emphasize, this would be just an additional form of torture and ill treatment that Palestinians are subjected to, but also the deprivation of the most important right, the right to life. Which is also in a way intertwined with Israeli military courts and the conviction rate of Palestinians, and how Israeli law is being used to weaponize and gain more state domination over the Palestinians.